Lawmakers are looking to pass several bills aimed at reducing racial inequalities within the state's criminal justice system. We spoke to a university professor and lawmaker who weighed in on these proposals. The clean slate legislation can potentially help thousands of people who face difficulties find work and housing because of their criminal records. This bill is calling for elimination of misdemeanor and certain lower-level felony convictions, not counting family violence crimes and sexual assault offenses. Michael Lawler, a criminal justice professor at the University of New Haven, speaking from the law enforcement perspective.
Law enforcement people will argue that the criminal records of individuals are important indicators as they're trying to evaluate what to do in the future. For example, investigating new criminal activity.
And the cannabis bill, also known as HB 6377, would allow the legalization of marijuana. Those who have been punished in the past for marijuana convictions can have their records erased.
There's now a battle over if it's going to be legal and sold legally and taxed, how are those revenues going to be divided up?
Another bill approved by the Judiciary Committee is looking to increase diversity on juries and avoid having too many residents from suburbs, which tends to be largely white. The legislation would also allow permanent residents who are not U.S. citizens to serve on juries. Representative Geraldo Reyes in support of this bill.
Listen, I believe that you're supposed to be having a jury of your peers, and if we're having a jury of our peers, it should look like the state. It should look like the cities and towns that we represent.
Lastly, one that may create the most discussions, gun seizures, or in other words, the red flag law. In light of the increased mass shootings around the country, this law would allow relatives and medical professionals to ask judges to order people's guns be taken away. Supporters of the bill believe it will save more lives, others arguing the term is too broad, as it may overlap with those who have a passion for collecting guns as a hobby or use it in nonviolent ways.
This one to me is what I believe smart gun legislature that will maybe provide another tool to try to eliminate these mass murders.